the co-presidents of the PRS PTO, and happy to welcome you here tonight. This talk is sponsored by the 4 elementary PTOs. Dr. Reilly was here in January, and she had such rave reviews that we wanted her to come back and speak just about elementary age kids. So I will just start by saying that each of the schools has phenomenal school adjustment counselors. So that is a great resource if you have not availed yourself of those individuals. If you do have, any issues with your kids, obviously pediatrician is also great, but the school adjustment counselors are pretty special. So Dr. Lopez-Reilly is the executive director of the William James College Center for Behavioral Health, Equity, and Leadership in Schools. Throughout her career, Dr. Lopez-Reilly has focused on translating research and clinical practice into accessible school and community-based approaches aimed at promoting youth mental health. She has a really long, amazing bio that I won't read in its entirety, but I will finish by saying that she's written multiple publications to support student mental health, including her book, Anxiety and Depression in the Classroom, A Guide to Promoting Self-Regulation in Young Students. So please welcome Dr. Reilly. Thanks.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for making the time to be here today to have a conversation about children's mental health. So today I'm going to be focusing at the elementary school level, but if you have questions about other age ranges or anything that I'm not covering today, we're definitely flexible, so I encourage you to raise your hand, shout out a question. I want to make sure that you leave today by getting the information that you came to get. So I wanted to begin by really thinking about what is it that we mean when we talk about mental health. You might have heard the terms mental health, mental illness, used interchangeably, emotional health. When I talk about mental health, I mean a more holistic perspective when we're really thinking about the daily emotional health and wellness of children. Of adults as well, of course, but since we're talking about kids today, we'll focus on kids. And really paying attention to emotional health and wellness means that it's a daily practice. One of the biggest interventions that we can really think about when we're trying to foster and maintain children's emotional health is actually thinking about prevention and thinking about what can we do on a daily basis. So while there are very effective treatments, and of course I will mention those to you, one of the things that I hope that we can focus on is what are some of the daily things that you can do? What are some of the responses to all of those anxious questions that you might be getting that might be helpful in calming some of those things down? And again, as I mentioned, please feel free to interrupt at whatever time, ask whatever clarifying questions you might have to make sure that all of your questions are answered. So I want to make a distinction between what we mean by being distressed, meaning that perhaps you're feeling a little anxious or there's something going on, but it's not quite to the level of a clinical diagnosis. So distress means that it might be something that's consistent with the developmental stage, right? So if you have little ones that are still afraid of the dark, or that might have some issues separating from you, or that might be worried about, things that are going to happen like thunderstorms or things like that, those are developmentally appropriate fears and things that are supposed to happen. So usually they will get through some of those bumps with some reassurance, with some routines, with some. If it's temporary, right, if it lasts maybe weeks or less, then we know that we're talking about something that is growing with them as they develop and mature. If it's context or situation specific, maybe they're about to start something new, or maybe there's a big transition coming, or maybe there's a big ending coming, like the end of the school year. Those are all normative times when you can see a little bit of a spike in distress. That's also normative. And it doesn't interfere with normal functioning or growth, right? If they're still able to have friends, maintain friends, go to school, engage with learning, all of those things are okay. And as a matter of fact, I always do conversations like this with teenagers too, and I tell them, if you're having a little bit of anxiety, that's actually a good thing. Anxiety is something that keeps you alert. It keeps you being discerning of the environment. And the same thing for little ones. Our goal is not to get rid of anxiety altogether, but to understand what it is, be able to label it, and then have skills to manage it. When it becomes more of a clinical concern is when it's out of context developmentally. So let's say that all of a sudden you're having a fourth grader that's having a hard time separating from you. That's not what I would expect from a fourth grader, so we would want to take a look at that. If it's pervasive, meaning that it's continuing over time and interfering with lots of areas of functioning, and particularly if you're not seeing any bounce back. Now, what I call a bounce back is, when you're having a hard day and you're feeling like, oh, nothing's going to work. You've tried a few things and you're still struggling. But then the next day you kind of bounce back. You're like, okay, well, let's have a reset. Let's see what's going on. When kids are having a hard time with that bounce back, when they're able to re-engage with what's going on, especially if it's lasting for about 3 weeks or longer, I would really want to pay more close attention to what's going on. So let's talk about anxiety first. As I mentioned, anxiety is something that is actually quite normative. And it's a process that our brain naturally engages in when we're trying to fill in the blanks, right? If we don't know what's coming up next, if we're not exactly sure about the outcomes of some things, what do we start thinking? That what if, right? Well, how about this? What if this happens? What if that happens? So that's okay. That's our brain, and that's what our brains do typically. And it's really associated with that fight, flight, or freeze response, right? We're determining whether a situation is a potential threat and how we need to respond to it. So again, at its core, anxiety is not a bad thing. But it has become the synonym, I feel, for stress or for I'm feeling overwhelmed, right? So kids are using the word anxiety interchangeably for a lot of other feeling states. So one of the first things you want to do is to really have some psychoeducation with kids about what is it that we mean when we say anxiety, right? So anxiety, again, impairs functioning, as we talked about before, not only when it gets in the way of engaging with friends, engaging with learning, but particularly when avoidance becomes the primary coping strategy, right? What I mean by that is, let's say there's a birthday party coming up, and the child is struggling with some anxiety and says, I don't want to go. You know what? It's going to be boring anyway. I don't want to go to that birthday party. Or a sleepover, or a family event. No, I don't want to go to the family event. It's always so boring. I don't want to go. When you start hearing avoidance as the primary way to deal with things that feel scary or worrisome, that's when, again, you might want to investigate a little bit more. Now, why are we talking about anxiety as the very first thing that we start with? Pre-pandemic, anxiety was one of the most common disorders in childhood. Post-pandemic, it's become even more so. So today I'm going to be talking to you about anxiety and depression because those have been the two primary areas of increase in symptomatology for kids ages 5 to about 17, okay? So we know that anxiety disorders typically start around age 11, but there are some that can begin as early as preschool age. And the reason why it's really important to think about it, again, from a prevention perspective, is we know that if there's one anxiety disorder that goes untreated, there's about a 50 to 60% likelihood that a secondary anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder can be developed, right? So what we're trying to do is get ahead of it, be able to treat those symptoms, and do that early enough so that we're not running into another diagnosis on top of that. There are three main components that we need to think about when we're considering what anxiety looks like in kids. The first one is excessive physiological arousal. How many of your kids get nervous poops in the morning before they have to go to school? Right? Or they have headaches, or they feel like they're sick or tired all the time. Primarily, it tends to be GI related, right? And that's actually because there is a nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system that is the one that gets us ready to run away or fight when we're in a threat state. And in order to do that, it has to let go of all those functions that are not very necessary. So things like digestion stops, right? You have to go to the bathroom so that you can be light and ready to run. So that nervous system is activated really, really quickly. So that's one of the reasons why you get so many of these GI symptoms that are going on. The other big component is avoidance of feared stimuli. So as I mentioned a little while ago, when kids start avoiding everything, that's when we really want to make sure that we intervene. And as a matter of fact, one of the most successful treatments for anxiety is actually called exposure therapy. And that means that I'm going to expose you to whatever it is that's causing you that fear rather than accommodating into the avoidance. So if you all have ever been in a situation where your child is anxious about something and he or she is avoiding it, you know how we tend to twist ourselves into a pretzel to sort of facilitate that avoidance so we won't have a meltdown, right? It's fine, okay, we'll go later, or fine, we'll do this at some other time, or let me find somebody that you feel really comfortable with to go with you to this event so that you will show up. Anybody do something like that? So part of the treatment is exposing them to that, and also us being part of understanding what behaviors we might be doing that are inadvertently supporting that avoidant behavior. And the third piece is cognitive distortions. What this means is kind of faulty thinking about how we assess and interpret a situation, right? So for example, somebody might think, I don't want to go to that birthday party because nobody is going to talk to me. I already know that they don't like me. I don't want to go. I'm going to be left out, right? There's this kind of black and white thinking associated with it. There's this fear-based thinking, and we really have to target those thoughts in order to be able to make the anxiety go away a bit. So these three things are why cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, is so actually effective with kids, because it targets all of these primary areas and it really helps them to restructure their thinking. So here are some of the symptoms. We talked about a lot of the body-based ones, but there might also be other things that seem a little bit more externalizing or a little bit more disruptive. So there might be crying or yelling, or sometimes getting so worked up because they don't want to do something. That's the method of avoidance, that they get really, really riled up and it ends up into a tantrum. It might end up looking like a million questions, right? So you're picking me up, right? But you said you're picking me up. And at what time? And what happens if you don't pick me up? And then what if your phone's not on? And then what if this? What if that? It turns out into those what if questions. There might be difficulty sleeping because our minds tend to have this thing that when we don't have any distractions at hand, we then go through all of the things that did not go well during the day. Or for adults, it's like we go through our to-do lists and it becomes hard to sleep. Kind of the same thing for kids when they're struggling with anxiety. And difficulty concentrating. So you might ask your child, for example, to do something, and they're like, wait, what? What did you say? Or they forget. Or you get very frustrated because you have repeated the same thing like 10 times and they still don't seem to remember. So difficulty concentrating is one of those symptoms that spills over, if you will, into the classroom environment, and that's one of the things that we hear from teachers a lot. So in the classroom, one of the things that kids who struggle with anxiety, and also, by the way, this is the same for kids who struggle with depression, is that it can be harder to have, to learn new things because of a slower processing speed, right? If you're having a lot of interfering thoughts, it can be hard to clear those thoughts enough to listen and pay attention and integrate new information. Just think about your own daily routine, right? Has anybody ever been so stressed that you're looking for your glasses and they're either on your face or your head, and you're like, I can't find my glasses, and you keep doing this and you still can't find your glasses? So when that nervous system that I talked about gets activated, it's almost like all of our resources go to our survival brain rather than the front part, thinking part of our brain. And short-term memory is impacted. Executive functions are impacted. So things like judgment, organization, following sequential directions, planning. And it's not until we're out of that survival mode and back into the front part of the brain that we're able to access those. So a little bit later, I'm going to tell you what the sequence of intervention should be so that we can actually help kids calm down enough to get back to that front part of the brain. Because what's one of the first things we do when kids are really dysregulated? What do? We do, or we say, what's wrong? Can you tell me? But use your words. What's going on, right? We use a lot of verbal cues, and we ask them to use a lot of executive functions when we're trying to figure out what's going on. But it's not very effective until they can get regulated from that body perspective first. So we're going to talk about that sequence. Does that answer your questions? Okay, thank you. All right, so a little bit of true and false. You can feel free to shout it out, or you can raise your hand, whatever feels comfortable. Depression is a medical illness, true or false? It's true. And it's really important that this is another thing that we let kids know about, that we let everybody who's kind of taking care of kids who are struggling with depression know. Many times, depression is seen as something that is separate from the biological occurrences of what's going on, but it is a medical illness. There is a chemical imbalance that happens in the brain when somebody's struggling with depression. You know, it impacts all areas of functioning, even things like your pain threshold. So for example, when someone is struggling with depression, they have a much higher sensitivity to pain. So when kids will say, my head hurts, my stomach hurts, my back hurts, my, muscles hurt, it's actually true. They have a lower sensitivity to pain. So we need to consider this a medical illness. How about too much stress always leads to depression? That is false, and that's really important, again, as we think about prevention, the kind of conversations and education that we have with kids, that we give them the right vocabulary in terms of what they're experiencing. Again, having a little stress is a good thing. Failing because you have done something wrong is a good thing. Being able to have a hard time and figure out the skills to bounce back is a good thing. So if we can practice that with kids when it's fairly low stakes in elementary school, so they have those skills for middle and high school, it's one of the best prevention interventions you could possibly have, right? So if they're complaining about stress, instead of saying, what can we do to take away the stress, we think about, okay, what is causing you stress? How is your stress showing up for you? And what can you do about it? So part of cognitive behavioral therapy is that kids tend to feel helpless and hopeless in the context of what they're doing. So you always want to invite the language of self-efficacy, meaning you have agency in what you're doing. What can we do? Okay, so that's going to be a really important question to ask them to keep in mind. So here are some symptoms that you would want to look for in children who are struggling with depression in the elementary school grades. Kids, when they're little, don't always necessarily manifest the sadness and sort of withdrawal that we might think about in adults. You do see a lot more irritability and anger in kids who are struggling with depression, especially when they're younger. It's almost like a quick temper, right? Like you're thinking everything was fine, and then all of a sudden there was a big switch. So that's something that happens often. With little ones, I always invite you to think about using play as a diagnostic tool. So if they're not engaging in imaginative play, if they're not engaging in play with others, that's a red flag for me. Now, granted, we had a lot of little ones who did not get opportunities for this kind of socialization during the pandemic. So we have to keep that in mind. And again, one of the biggest sort of prevention interventions that we can do is think about what proactive activities, social activities can kids engage in so that they have the opportunity to catch up on that learning and growing and problem solving that happens through play. And I'm advocating this all the way through high school, not just little ones. It's really important that they have those social interactions. Regressions and milestones is another big one, especially for little ones, and statements and questions about death or dying. It is not very often that very young children, ages 5 through 7, let's say, will develop depression. If they do, however, it's usually pretty severe. It's very biologically based in terms of the disruption in neurotransmitters. Usually we start seeing symptoms of depression sometime around ages 13, 14. But part of what we're noticing now is that younger kids are actually developing more symptomatology. So for example, even the rate of suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts among kids ages 10 to 14 has increased post-pandemic. So again, one of our best interventions is to be really proactive and to really think about what prevention we can do on a daily basis. These are sort of internal happenings that are very typically seen with both anxiety and depression. There are high levels of shame, meaning that you might hear statements like, "I'm sorry I make things so hard," or, nobody else has to deal with this and I get stuck with this, right? It's sort of that being embarrassed or ashamed about the emotional experience. Difficulties with emotional regulation, meaning that it's really much easier to access hot emotions, if you will, right? So irritability, sadness, frustration, and to come down from that. And it's harder to access the more positive emotions like joy and happiness, feeling content. The experience of those is felt less and less often. So when you see that kind of dysregulation where kids kind of feel stuck at the more hot emotions, that's another red flag. This is also why when kids are already really struggling with depression and you try to convince them of the good things that are going on for them or how wonderful they are, it only makes them more frustrated because they're not feeling that experience. They're not connecting with that. Lack of healthy coping skills, meaning avoidance is the primary coping skill. Hopelessness and helplessness, like, why am I even going to try that? Nothing works. Or, no matter what I do, it doesn't seem to change, right? So when you hear statements like that, that's more of a sense of helplessness. And then low self-efficacy, meaning it doesn't matter, like I just have bad luck and bad things are going to happen, or, it doesn't even matter if I try. Questions about that? Okay. Experiencing suicidal thoughts is a key symptom of depression. Is that true or false? It's not always the case. It's usually more with moderate to severe depression that there are active suicidal thoughts. You might hear those things in younger kids, like, I'm going to run out of traffic in traffic, or I'm going to jump out the window, right? You might hear it as more active things. In older kids, you might hear more like, I wonder what it would be like if I wasn't around. But it's not always a symptom of depression. And so that's another thing, that when we're talking to kids about a dysregulation in mood, oftentimes, even very young kids are reluctant to say what they're truly experiencing, because somehow they're still getting messages that if you say something like this, you're going to be taken away, or people are going to think that you're crazy or there's something wrong with you, right? So the language that we use is really important, to say things like, we all have times when our emotions take a dip. And the important thing is, when we're in that dip, we have to figure out how we can get back up and who we might need to help us get back up. And if that dip is ever so low that you're really thinking about hurting yourself, please let me know, right? So having these conversations is really important. Research indicates that LGBTQ plus youth are at higher risk for suicide than their heterosexual peers. True or false? 5 times higher likelihood of attempts and completed suicides. It's really important that we start thinking about this as early as very young in elementary school, because a lot of kids will already have questions, be asking, might experience gender dysphoria for some kids. So really being able to have these conversations is also very important. If you talk to someone about suicide, you're putting ideas into their head. Yes, it is false, and I'm really happy to hear everybody saying that, because one of the biggest worries in the past had been that if we even said the word depression or even said the word suicide, we were going to be putting ideas in kids' heads as to potential solutions. The research shows that is not the case, and as a matter of fact, being able to use the word openly and open lines of communication is a huge suicide prevention intervention. Right? So for example, with trans kids, using their chosen names can reduce the likelihood of suicide attempts by 50%. Just using the proper pronouns and chosen names. With kids who are contemplating suicide, being able to have a conversation about it actually reduces the likelihood that there will be an attempt. So it's really important to use the proper language and have conversations about it. So how do you talk to them about it? There might have been a loss in the community, in the family. They might ask you questions. They might see something on TikTok. They might see something on some other social media platform. These questions will come up. So seize the opportunity when it comes up. If they ask you a question, stop whatever you're doing and really pay attention to answering that. Kids will pick it up really quickly if they sense that they will somehow make us nervous or sad if they ask us a question about it, or if we can't tolerate the conversation, and then they'll stop. So it's really important to seize those moments. Understand what a suicidal crisis is. So a suicidal crisis means that when somebody's contemplating it, they don't really want to die. They're trying to figure out how to make the pain stop. So if we can explain that to kids, saying, you know, when you start feeling distress, the best thing we can do is talk about it so we can always find a solution. And children as young as 10 can consider suicide, so using words like depression becomes more important. Again, words and language really matter. And here are some questions that you can ask them, right? What have you heard? What do you know or want to understand more about? How do you feel about it? Have you ever thought about ending your life? Have you ever heard any of your friends talk about suicide? And I know these things are hard to talk about, but I'm always here to talk to you about it. I am a parent. I have 2 boys, and I have had to ask the question, and I'm a psychologist. I do this for a living. You would think it would be easy. It is not, especially when you're sitting in front of your child and you're asking that question because you're terrified about what the answer might be. So I get it, that it's really hard, but it is so important to be able to ask that question and then sit with whatever comes back, right? To be able to sit with that emotion and say, I'm here holding this with you. Questions about this? So with little ones, I always want to start with building a feelings vocabulary. So one of the things that research shows is that the more words we have for feelings and to label our feeling state, the better we're able to regulate our emotions. So from itty bitty ones, I would start saying, we're like happy, sad, confused, excited, whatever, there are lots of charts that you can use and show them the corresponding facial expressions. So prevention-wise, itty bitty, build emotional vocabulary. And I would keep doing that, right? Because how often have you asked your kids, hey, how you doing? How you feeling? Sometimes I just get a grunt like, right? I don't even get a word. And so the more that we can practice that, the better. And the more that we can practice saying, how are you feeling outside of a crisis or outside of a tough situation, the better. I would definitely start talking to kids about, when they're feeling dysregulated, you can say something, and I'm talking like 3, 4, your body's telling me that there's something going on. How are you feeling? So you can start that question. What can we do when our body feels stressed or when our body feels hot like this, right? You can use particular language for it. I would say that 3rd graders are already talking about how stressed they are. I mean, I've been hearing kindergartens talk about how stressed they are. So the word stress, they already have heard, probably from us a lot, are using it. So we want to define it for them. And we want to say, what does that look like for you? What does that feel like in your body? And what can we do about it? And one of the things that you can do is you can actually practice different skills every night. I mean, you know how when they were little, we used to have like bath time routines and then we had bedtime routines. And I'm sure you still have some of that where you get into your PJs, you read a book. I would incorporate emotional health and wellness components into that too. So tell me 3 things that you were really excited or proud about today. Tell me 3 things that felt hard. How did you manage that? What did you do? Who helped you? What would you do differently? Things like progressive muscle relaxation as part of bedtime routine is fantastic, especially for kids who tend to hold on to their anxiety a little bit at night. Anybody familiar with progressive muscle relaxation? Okay, so progressive muscle relaxation, and you can actually Google it. There are tons of really great scripts that you can find online, but it's basically targeting different parts of your body, tensing them up, and then relaxing and noticing that sensation of relaxation. It's almost like a meditation that you can do, and it helps kids release some of that tension. It's great for adults, by the way, too. So if you want to try it for yourselves, I highly recommend it. You can do visualizations, right? So you can say, whatever they like. Imagine that you're walking, I'm going to say the beach because that's my happy place, but, it could be the forest, it could be whatever. And, you find something that really makes you happy. What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it smell like? One of the things you always want to do when you're working with young children, but actually children of all ages, is you want to do activities that appeal to all of their senses. The amygdala, the part of our brain that gets activated really quickly with anxiety, learns through a sensory mechanism. It's not a verbal component of our brain. It learns through smell, touch, sight, sound, right? I'll give you an example. If you've ever been in a car accident, you tend to remember most vividly smells or sounds that you heard, right? And part of that is what we need to address in treatment. It's not so much the words or what you were thinking, it's what you were experiencing. So we are trying to get our little ones' amygdalas to calm down, right? Engage the parasympathetic nervous system, the one that helps us rest and digest. And in order to access that, we need to do that through different senses. Okay, so anything that has to do with taking deep breaths, deep breathing, again, tons of different scripts for that online. Anything that helps them with touch, maybe they have a special like lovey or something, that they still sleep with. Scents, so, having lavender, having something calming and soothing. Maybe they like to have sounds like a sound machine or something like that. All of those things are what engage the amygdala to calm down. And those can be incorporated into daily rituals and are really important to do so that they don't wait to use those coping skills when they're stressed, because they won't be able to engage those coping skills when they're already dysregulated. You want them to be sort of part of who they are and can access them quickly when they need to. So what should you do? I'm going to go quickly through this one, but one of the things that has come through out of the pandemic is that it's not really easy to make a strict diagnosis and say, oh, this is anxiety, oh, this is depression, oh, this is ADD. You know what? The symptoms have been coming out manifesting so differently and sometimes so acutely that it's hard to be exactly precise from a diagnostic perspective. So instead, we're taking what's called a transdiagnostic approach, which means what are the best, most effective things from treatment for both anxiety and depression, and let's put those together and do skill building. And that includes relaxation, cognitive restructuring, which we'll talk about, problem solving. Now for anxiety, remember I told you exposure is really critical. For depression, it's actually behavioral activation. So if the depression is moderate to severe, kids might have a hard time getting up out of bed, attending school, going to see friends. So that behavioral activation is really important, which means getting them up and moving. Okay? All right. So like you mentioned, treatment is very important, but not always immediately accessible. So what can we do in the meantime? And if you are already in treatment, what can you do to supplement, those 1 hour a week visits, right? So we want to go back to what we know. One of the things we want to do is not get panicky ourselves, sort of monitor our own level of anxiety in response to what's going on, and go back to things that we know work well. Co-regulation. Whenever a child or a member of the family develops an emotional disorder, it's a family issue. It's not an individual issue, right? So we need to think about how can we co-regulate, meaning how can we pay attention to our own mental health, manage our own anxiety, in order to help regulate the child. Emotions are really contagious, particularly anxiety. And so if we respond in an escalated way, kids will also respond in an escalated way. And practice skills, okay? Daily basis practicing skills so that the kids know how to access them. So one of the things I would say is start by taking kind of like an emotional health inventory of how your household thinks about, talks about, manages emotions, right? Remember I mentioned that vocabulary, words, how we respond every day is really important. So think about this, right? What's our family culture as it relates to talking about feelings? There are some families that prefer to be more action-based rather than talking out feeling-based. There are some families that like to process a lot. And so we need a happy medium of the two, if you will. One of the most important things, though, is one, expressing to children very directly and concretely that it is okay to show any emotion. Especially boys, it's okay if you need to cry. And for girls, it's okay if you want to be angry, right? And say any emotion you have is completely valid, and it's also temporary. So we give it a name, we acknowledge it, and we figure out what to do about it. The main thing is not letting kids feel like they are at the mercy of any emotion that will come up at any time, but to say we all have emotions, we all do, right? We have some good days, we have some bad days. As long as we're able to label it, give it a name, that will in and of itself bring the acuity of it down, and figure out what to do with it, we're good, right? But it's okay to have them. See what kind of patterns you get stuck in when you're feeling emotionally drained, when you're anxious. Is there something going on in the family that might be driving affect, or any changes that might be adding to more distress or more anxiety or more sadness, right? We all have lots of things that happen to us in life. I know that when I get overwhelmed, I get very short with my words. And so when kids are asking me something, I'm like, stop, I can't talk right now. And they're like, well, geez, Mom, And so I have to stop and be really, really mindful and aware to say, can you please give me 2 minutes? I need to finish what I'm doing, and then I will give you my full attention. So for us, it's kind of seeing what patterns are we falling into to avoid the anxiety or to accommodate the anxiety. That's really important. So you should know about yourself. What are your own triggers? What's your own coping style? Are you taking care of yourself emotionally? If you are running on absolute empty, you cannot be as regulated, or you cannot help as efficiently. So taking care of yourself is really important. And then you want to know, what do I know about my child? What's his or her coping? What works? What soothes them? And what does he or she respond to? One of the things that might happen is that perhaps you have a coping style where you're a big information seeker. And you're like, you need to know plan A, B, C, D, E, and you want to know all the information, you want to have it now. And your child might be more of a, kind of go with the flow kind of kid. Those coping styles can go at odds if people are under high emotion or high stress. So during those times, is there someone else who could help you communicate things? Is there someone who can tap in to help? The other thing is that physical touch is really important and helpful in soothing. So rubbing back, do you need something for your tummy? Rubbing somebody's head or arm. Those things actually re-engage that parasympathetic nervous system that I was talking about. So as I started mentioning, when we're really dysregulated and we go to that survival brain, we actually have to get our bodies relaxed and in a place where we're not like this in order to be able to cognitively and verbally process through different things. So going rapid fire into what's wrong, what happened, who did this, or, what's going on, tell me how you feel, tell me what's going on. That might not be the best intervention right away because the kids or adults will still be feeling a little bit rattled, right? So what you want to do is you want to do something that relaxes the body. And I will be happy to share these slides with you actually, so that way you have the script. So you want to relax. You want to slow down your breathing, right? One of the best ways to kick that parasympathetic nervous system back up is to do deep breathing. And then you want to think. Think of a place where you can be, focus on all the sensory details, right? Just once you're there, and that, that spike of initial adrenaline that comes with anxiety takes about 10 minutes to kind of calm down. So you want to wait about 10, 15 minutes, and then you can do more of the verbal processing. But for that first initial spike, until that goes down, this is the kind of thing that you want to do. So you can do the 5-finger breathing, which is basically you take your hand and you trace it by breathing in, holding it, breathing out, breathing in, hold it, breathe out, right? It's really quick. That is something that I teach kids. It's very portable. They could do it on the bus. They could do it in the classroom, and it's a way to help them calm down. 30-second narration is basically taking a look at something and describing it to yourself. And again, it's using colors and sounds, all of the senses. For some kids, you might want to have them do some exercise, running up and down the stairs, doing some jumping jacks. Sometimes that, invigorating exercise can actually help settle them down. I know that sounds contradictory, but it actually does help. Music. You might want to have a dance party. You might have, like a sing-off or a dance-off. Because music accesses a totally different part of the brain that helps them be able to relax, but then access the verbal piece. And I'll tell you this. How many of you remember songs? I'll just say the 80s because those were my favorite. You can remember every lyric, right? It comes on, you're like, yeah, and you're singing along. And yet somebody asks you what you had for dinner last night, and you're like, I'm not really sure what I had for dinner last night. Has that happened to anyone? Right? We encode emotion, we encode experiences through music and sound and rhythm. So for little ones, this is why a lot of things that they learn for coping have a rhythm to it, right? They're learning regulation and how to manage their body, head, shoulders, knees, and toes, right? So anything that you can do to incorporate some fun music, tune, anything like that will be really helpful and they'll remember it. Initiating conversations, and I'm being mindful of the time, so I'm going to touch upon these things quickly, but if you have a question, please let me know. One of the things that 3 things that are so important. First and foremost, put everything else down. No phone, no multitasking, being fully, deeply present for questions about emotions. It can be light-hearted questions. It can be a deep, meaningful conversation. But what's really important is that there is a sense of being fully present and connected with the emotional experience. Don't ever be afraid to say, I don't know, right? If your child comes up to you and they say, Mom, my best friend told me that she was thinking about killing herself. It's okay for you to say, I'm not exactly sure what we need to do, but let's find someone who can help us. It's better for you to say that than to dismiss or minimize the conversation because it's actually the affect that you want to connect with rather than the actual information. And then practice reflective listening. So whenever our kids come to talk to us, what's the first thing we try to do, right? They have a problem. They come to talk to us about a problem. What do we try to do? Fix it. We try to fix it, right? Of course that's what we do. There are kids. We want to make sure they're okay. We don't want to see them struggle. But often in the process of trying to fix it, we bypass parts of the conversation that are really important because in our experience, in our adult brains, we have already interpreted the situation and come up with 3 different solutions, right? But kids learn how to regulate emotions and process and problem solve by telling you the same story like 20 times. And it's usually when you're right in bed, about to fall asleep, and they come sit next to you and they're like, can I tell you something? And you're like, oh, I was so close. But that's actually the process of them saying that is really important. So reflective listening, active listening means that you're not jumping to problem solve. You're not jumping to interpret what has happened, but you ask curious questions like, what would be helpful for me to do right now? What can I do to help you? Right? And as much as you can, repeat back the same words that they're saying. So I'm hearing you say that you were feeling really frustrated when this happened. Did I get that right? Sometimes that's all the intervention that it takes. Right? Have you ever been in a pickle and you're really angry and you want to talk to somebody and they're like, well, let me tell you what to do. And you're like, I've already thought about it. I just need somebody to listen, right? Same thing with kids. And if they need to repeat it 20 times, let them. That's part of the learning process. Okay, so the cognitive restructuring that we talked about, changing the way that we are interpreting situations and the way that our thoughts are formulated. It doesn't mean that we change our thoughts to something like, everything's perfect, everything will be fine. No. Instead, what we want them to do is use realistic thinking, and there's always going to be the part that includes that there's a sense of self-efficacy. Here's what I mean. The wrong kind of reassurance sounds like, oh, that can never happen. I'll tell you why. We don't know. We actually went through a pandemic. We don't know what else could happen, right? So we can't say that'll never happen. It's also minimizing their worry instead of validating it. Oh, just stop worrying. That's overreacting. Has anybody told you that you're overreacting? And you're like, oh, you want to see overreacting? I will show you overreacting. Again, kind of minimizing and not really helping them to find a word for the feeling state. And things will be back to normal. What do you think is wrong with saying things will be back to normal? Well, yes, normal is definitely defined differently, but that means you have to wait for things to be normal. This implies that it's outside of your control for things to be better. This is the right kind of reassurance. You can say something like, this is a new situation for us, and we'll figure out what to do one step at a time. Notice that now you have included the phrase, we will figure out what to do. I'm here in this with you, but you're also included in the problem solving, right? You can tolerate nervous feelings and have ways to respond to your worries. What would be helpful now? Okay, so all of this is, you're not invalidating their feelings, you're validating them, acknowledging them, but then you're turning it around to the opportunity for them to be an active agent in understanding and knowing what to do. This is the foundation for cognitive restructuring. Obviously, in therapy, we go into it more. But if you want to teach your kids the basics of CBT, is that their thoughts influence how they feel, and how they feel influences how they behave. So if I'm thinking that you don't like me, I'm going to get nervous, and I'm going to want to run away. But if I'm thinking, she has this curious look on her face, maybe that's her learning face. I'll keep going with my lecture until I'm done. I won't run away. That's a different scenario, right? So these are the basics of cognitive restructuring. These are some ways to challenge those negative thoughts, right? So when they tell you, oh, nobody cares about me, well, what's another way that we could look at that? Or what would people who care about me say? Or is this really the worst thing that could happen? If the worst thing really did happen, what could I do to deal with it, and who could help me? Okay? I actually print stuff like this. I put it on my fridge. I have it in different places where I can see it, where the kids can see it, so it becomes part of their vocabulary. So in short, mental health is not just something that we look at when kids are having a hard time. It's something that we need to take a look at every day to figure out what little thing can we do to promote health and wellness. Not every day will be good, but if you can teach coping skills really from early on, that they can sort of commit to memory, it can be part and parcel of their practice, of how they talk to you, having open conversations about emotions, asking how they're feeling when things are going well as when they're not going so well. All of those things are incredibly important protective factors that when things do get bad, they will be able to rely on to have a better outcome. So that's our time for today. I'm happy to stay, and if you have any other questions, I'm happy to take those. But I know that some of you have to go probably for bedtime routines. So if you need to go, please feel free to do that. And if anybody wants to stay and has questions, I'm happy to do that.